You will fail. So what? Everybody does. It's time to redefine success. Meet Body. Fun workouts and a week off. Healthy eating and indulgence. Liking yourself no matter what. Yeah, you will fail. We all will. But we're not going to let that be the end. You see that? We're already making progress. So let's keep going. We are Body. Start your free trial at body.com. That's BODI.com.
Game over, man. Game over.
You're gonna need a bigger boat. So serious.
I am Iron Man.
This is a tasty burger.
Welcome to the InSession Film Podcast.
Welcome to the new podcast presented by the female film critics of InSession Film. We are speaking, we love movies, we are women in session. Ms. Zita Short of the 300 Passions podcast is here. I am Kristin Battestella at Therefore Review. Zita had an interesting point. We have so many topics to discuss on our list, and some of them get into more film criticism, some of them are just on specific films. And, you know, we realized we have, even as film critics, we have a lot of blind spots. And we wanted to sit down and have a little chat on you know, that's good, that's bad, maybe not. And Zita, I asked you specifically, was this going to be a broad overview or was this going to be our personal blind spots? Because I initially thought of the bigger picture. You know, I came from the publishing background where, you know, back in the day, there was a very straight path and you specialized. You started in short stories to show your cred, and then you got an agent, then you got a contract, and you were with that one house. You were with Kensington or Harlequin or Tor. That was what you were as the author. Then, you know, digital media comes along and it was like, diversify everything, have a blog, have a website, write anything and everywhere and get your name out there and be known. And then it seemed like the opposite pendulum. And I feel like that's part of the problem in film criticism, because you have a lot of old white men who don't specialize in anything, and they review everything, whether the film is for them or not. Even that, I feel like, is that a foreign concept of, guess what? There are people who make films that aren't for old white men.
I don't,
and we're not men.
I remember that being a controversy. I sort of don't mind that. I think the bigger problem is that you don't have enough diversity within the field of film criticism in general. And I think obviously it would be great if not so many of the prominent film critics were white and straight and cisgender, of course. At the same time, I think it's fair for a critic to review everything. That idea that, oh, this film should only be limited to critics who fit into specific boxes, I don't love that. I sort of get the argument that, oh, well, this type of film might appeal to this critic more. But personally, and maybe I'm expecting too much out of readers, but typically when I read a review from a critic that I'm aware of, where I've consumed a lot of their work and I sort of have an understanding of their specific critical sensibility, I understand going in, well, this probably didn't appeal to them. And I think their job in that case is to provide an entertaining review that has insight about why they felt that way. And I know that we don't typically look towards negative reviews fondly. At the same time, as a fan of film criticism, you could even say, my take on reviewing is that it sort of negatively impacts the public perception of film critics, because I think there are a lot of people who think that, oh, well, the important part of that job is that you rate these movies and you tell people whether or not they should see it. And I don't necessarily think that that's the primary objective. I have read plenty of negative reviews of films that I love, that are fascinating to me, because this person puts me in a certain mindset and explains where they are coming from. And so a lot of negative reviews, I don't look at them as the work of haters. And a lot of people seem to perceive them that way automatically. Of course, there are plenty of cases in which people might use offensive language in reviews, for example. That, I think, is a completely different case. If it's just a straight white man giving a negative review to a female-led film for reasons that don't appear to have anything to do with sexism, that's fine. I don't think that that person should be taken off of that specific beat just because they happened to dislike one or two films.
I've said it before. I think I don't even have like she or her or anything on any of my handles. And it's interesting when I get comments on Twitter, because there are some people who just say like Mr. Review. And I think, well, you probably then must not actively pay attention to me if you don't see all the Women InSession retweets that I tend to do, that maybe it's not a Mr. But then you also get the opposite, where you get people who are like, oh, you're just a woman who's bitching about a movie that you didn't like. And it's like, well, no, there's a little more nuance to it, to film criticism than that, And it's funny because I just did a couple, I'm working on one now, some more recent horror films for InSessionFilm.com. And our editor, Dave, said, oh, you didn't put a grade rating on the review. And I'm like, oh, you do that? Because even sometimes to me, I'm like, I don't normally do that. Like, what's a 3 or 4 star movie? I feel it's so relative. I'm like, wow, okay, I guess like a B+. Sure. Even that I feel like is too small of across the board kind of answer. And I feel like, well, that's not film criticism if you're not getting into all the nitty gritty, And in our first episode of 2023, we said what are our 2023 goals, and mine was to watch more recent films, and I have watched more recent horror movies, so I'm getting a little better, but I definitely have blind spots when it comes to new films, what's recent, what's popular. I mean, if anything, like when something is popular, I'm less interested in it, which I know is a completely terrible, weird thing to say as a film critic. It should be, no, I should be on the hot topics and be timely. And it's like, but that doesn't interest me. I feel like it's just your voice gets lost in the noise.
Yes, that's an interesting point to make. And there's also a sense with contemporary cinema that, one, it feels as though there's more to watch, because everything's coming out at the same time. There are positive reviews that you can find for almost anything. And so you think, well, God, do I have to see 300 films this year? And some people do. Some of the really great critics are able to keep up with that sort of heavy workload. But most of the time, I feel you sort of get a clearer picture of how the year's crop of films panned out a couple of years down the line. And so you can look back and you can root out a lot of the really great films. At the same time, as people would point out, you do face that problem of certain films, which are great, falling into obscurity and becoming hidden gems. So I get the argument that while these films are new, you might as well make an effort to see them, because if a film doesn't make enough money, or if its reviews are mixed to positive, it might disappear in a couple of years' time, because film studios are not great at distributing or marketing copies of movies that aren't huge financial successes.
It's funny the way, in that regard, movie making has kind of reflected publication, which was one of the big problems of publication, was that when you had your Stephen King or your Harry Potter, that was what made the whole publication industry in the red for that year. Where when we were going to the bookstore model, it was only the big name books were what was on the tables in the front. And you couldn't hardly find the catalog books, old books, unusual things, because there just wasn't bookshelf space. And it's so funny that in the advent of streaming, there's just not a lot of platform space for movies. It's too crowded, it's too wild. And it's intriguing because I feel the opposite happens, because there's this divide between film criticism and an audience. Shadon and Erica are at South by Southwest. Ryan's at South by Southwest Film Festival. And last fall, we had talked about The Legend of Molly Johnson. And it was in Hulu that I could put it in my queue. And Erica had seen that at a festival like the year before. And a lot of these horror movies that I find that are really great, they're these independent films, sometimes I have to wait several years before they come out. And I feel like there's also a lot, you said there's not enough diverse film critics, but there's also, specialization versus accessibility. I mean, some people just don't get access to these films. And it's funny because when I'm doing all horror is a whole separate world where, again, there has to be almost a personality where you have to be like the cool rad bitch or something. Yeah, horror, blood, gore, woo, or something, or be all svelte like Elvira or something in order to make noise to be one of the leaders in that genre. And it's like, that's too finite, I feel. And then, when I first started blogging, because I had print things that I decided to put on my blog. That's how I started the I Think Therefore I Review, which I think is now a silly name, but what can you do? When I wanted to join a lot of like the critic circles or things, they say, well, you have classic TV and there's not enough classic film, or classic film would say, well, no, you also have a lot of horror. Like, and I'm like, so you don't want me to see everything. You do only want something specific. And it's like that doesn't seem like it has longevity. So I feel like a lot of critics are hurt by not being able to get to festivals, not being able to get screeners, accessibility. And I know you have this problem being in a foreign country.
Yes, that's certainly true. It is more difficult if you live in a remote location, as I do, to gain access to those critic circles and even to screeners. And it can be frustrating if you're not born in New York or Los Angeles or London. It is hard. And in a lot of cases, if you come from outside those areas, it's sort of impossible to gain access to these things. So that's a point of frustration on my part. At the same time, I wanted to do this episode, and I know it sounds sort of ridiculous from the outside, us sitting here for an hour and telling you about films that we haven't seen. You think, oh God, they're running out of ideas already. But the reason that I wanted to discuss this was that if you're a long-time listener, you've probably picked up on the fact that, like any other person, Kristin and I do have a couple of blind spots, and there are a couple of areas of film that we are not that familiar with. And so hopefully over the next however long we do this for, we can fill in some of those and gain more insight and perspective on these things. And we've already done episodes on topics that you're very interested in, for example, say horror movies, which are not my forte at all. And then we also discussed Jennifer Jones, who is my favorite actress. I've seen all of her films. And you, of course, are not a fan, so you're only familiar with one or two, or more than that, but a handful of her films.
I like that our 6 ladies for InSessionFilm.com, the things that we've also written, you can find at InSession. I like that even within our group, we all have different backgrounds and we're not as diverse as we could be. I'd love to get more guests in the future if we get to have more topics. So, and we had a couple folks liking and retweeting when we were talking about William Holden. So that was something I thought, geez, nobody's going to care to hear about William Holden. Amy talking about William Holden love, but we had comments about that. And Brendan was talking nice about some of the things that we say and do. So I love that we have different voices. And you suggested that we could do some of our critics interviews, get to know us when we have our 1-year anniversary. That would be a lot of fun, because I feel like part of it is our personalities, that people have to know who you are today. Yes. Because when we did this podcast, I said, geez, again, are we doing something too broad? Do we need to be more specific? Every podcast has to have a hook, and we can't always be, well, I love this and you hate that. How did you get into doing romance?
Oh, yes. So the romantic genre, I think from a young age, I was attracted to it. And perhaps this is a ridiculous pseudo-intellectual defense, but I think one of the points of fascination with this genre is that so much of it is about negotiating the manner in which women are perceived. Historically, we viewed it as a very sexist genre, in part because a lot of these films heavily suggest that a woman's life is not complete if she does not have a man by her side, and the notion that marriage is in essence the end of the portion of a woman's life in which she gets to make choices and in which she is important in a sense. And after that, she gets married, she has children, and everything is fine. She doesn't have to think about anything again. And that's certainly a problem that comes up in a lot of these movies. I won't deny that. You watch some older films and you think, not loving this. But I do think that there are examples of the genre that are more complex than that. And one of the things that I ran into was just, if you're watching an older film from a couple of decades ago that features a woman in a leading role, most of the time it's a romantic movie. So in part, I love the genre just because I'm a chick and I like to identify with women on screen. And so it's easiest to look towards this genre as a breeding ground for great actresses. And they really get an opportunity to show off their range in these films. And for as much as the genre is limited or constrained by the formulas that we associate with it, there are a lot of films, especially from the 30s, that are a lot more cynical and hard-bitten than we would expect them to be. And I think that people should give some of these films a go. Watch Sadie McKee, watch Possessed. These are not movies for the faint of heart. And again, it sort of comes back around to me loving melodrama. I do enjoy films that have sort of overwrought plots in which a lot happens. I'm not a very sedate person, so I respond to that sort of passion. And the romance genre provides you with that more than any other genre, I would say. And you'll get into your love of horror, of course. But one of the things that sort of turns me off about that genre is that violence doesn't do anything for me. And I don't mean this in I disapprove of people who are titillated by violent imagery. I'm not one of those people. I don't think that you're evil if you enjoy watching people get cut up on screen. I don't think that you literally want to go out and stab people in real life if you enjoy slasher movies. At the same time, I'm bored by it more than having any sort of morally outraged response to it, which I think is what it's meant to elicit. It's meant to be thrilling and provocative, and it's meant to make you think afterwards. It's meant to be a conversation starter. And it's just, okay, he started knifing her in the back. Oh, now we've moved around to her front and she's topless, of course. It just doesn't really hit the spot for me. And I guess you would say the problem with romance movies is that so many of them are ridiculous and absurd, and they're not nearly as deep as, say, horror movies, which manage to do so much more visually in a lot of cases, in telling stories, in conveying messages, in touching upon themes that sort of link the vast majority of films within that genre together. Whereas romance movies, they're far more variable, for as much as I complained about the formulaic nature of these films. But I think the issue that a lot of film critics have is that as a genre descriptor, it's sort of limited, because the vast majority of movies, at least in the past, did feature a romantic subplot of some kind. And so there is this sense that, well, does every movie in which two people flirt and then get married at the end of the film count as a romance? It's more difficult to define. Whereas horror is this genre with a very strong lineage. And so from a critical perspective, it's much easier, not easier, but it's much more significant in a review to touch upon how said film fits into the genre, whether it draws on the influence of horror classics, and what it means in this day and age to be taking these tropes that could seem outdated in some regards and updating it for the concerns that we have now.
Well, the formulaic of the rom-com we definitely discussed already. We have a couple episodes you could go back and listen to that. Horror, I find it's funny because to me it's so funny. Writing reviews is still almost like you're doing a book report. And I used to have like a checklist when I'm doing horror, and I would say, what are the special effects? Does this look good? Is it scary? And who is the audience for this? And it's interesting how that's changed over time, because when you're looking at something like classic or retro like the 80s, you would say, wow, how did they do that special effect? That's intriguing that they could do that then. They could get away with it then. They pushed the envelope. It was extreme, as opposed to now where it's like, big deal, a special effect. Somebody whooshed across the room with something invisible. Big deal. That doesn't impress me. I said this to my husband the other day when we turned on a movie, and I said, is this one of these movies where I'm going to figure it out the first 10 minutes? And he's like, no, why do you always have to do that? Like, because some of these films are so obvious. And I think it was before the pandemic, I wrote an article about how streaming has changed my viewing habits. I think that was what I called it, because I thought I used to review something and say, what are the good things about this? Why is this worth watching? Particularly because I like looking at the things that are unusual or obscure, not the popular things that everybody's going to love and watch anyway. And now I feel like I'm the opposite, where there's so much, and there's so much good and bad, forgettable, mediocre kind of things, where it's more like, I think I get this negative viewpoint of, why is this worth my time? Is this worth continuing? Because I've got so much other streaming stuff that I could just tune out and go watch instead. So I feel that industry is not the word, the technology has kind of changed my perspective of the genres, which I feel like is bad. I know it's bad. And one of my blind spots, I know you've got a huge list too, but one of my blind spots is actually Asian horror films, because I love the ones, there's a couple Hammer crossover ones in the 60s, Legend of the Golden Vampires. And like, there's some Paul Naschy films that he filmed in Japan. And I like what I've seen. They're just, a lot of them are, again, inaccessible, cease to exist. The mid-century Mexican horror movies are like that as well, where you see these lists of all these kind of Abel Salazar films, these films that were obviously made in the 50s and 60s. They were very popular, but now you're lucky to see a handful of them. And I feel like were they deliberately buried because there were American remakes are going on. And that's how I feel about Asian horror, because things like Audition, I guess they used to show in like the Turner Classic Movies, like Underground, like there was an area where you could access these films, pre-internet digital age. But then we got into that early aughts of all the Hollywood remakes of the Asian horror movies. And it was always like the blonde woman in a foreign country with a creepy kid. And it was because we had these like American things in your face that they weren't. I think The Ring, maybe The Grudge, I saw a lot of these in the movie theater. I think they were okay, but it was like I never had the opportunity to see what was probably the better Asian horror film. And it's like I've just never gone back to looking into those, because there's so much more to see now, which is frustrating to me. I feel bad that I've got a hole there, which I realize because I expressly enjoy watching other foreign horror films. So I'm like, I know that's me. I know I should work on that. I think I've got some Paul Naschy discs from a Netflix queue in the mailbox today.
Yes, and that's something that we should touch upon before we get into the main topic, I guess. A lot of what limits our ability to see certain films is the manner in which they are distributed. For as much as it's us being lazy and failing to seek out certain films that we know we really should have watched by this point, it's also just the fact that it is really difficult to find certain films, even if they have a great reputation in cinephile circles. If you didn't happen to be at that film festival in 1988, it is near impossible to track down this Russian drama about telemarketers who have to go on the run after stealing money from their employers. It's just, it's really impossible sometimes to find these movies. And I find it really odd. I would think surely there's some money in this. And I would be willing to pay $4 to rent this online. I'm not the cheapest person in the world, but it really is complicated. And especially, this is another sign of my ignorance, but as a person who only speaks the one language, whenever I try to track down foreign films, often you face the struggle of, oh God, it doesn't have subtitles. And clearly that's my problem. I should focus on learning some other languages. But even then, it would really help when I'm trying to watch a German film, for example, to just have some assistance there, some guidance. And it can be difficult to find that. So I don't think that it's entirely the fault of audiences that they haven't necessarily opened themselves up to some of these foreign language films or art house films, because by and large, the market is limiting their opportunities. They don't get these films sort of waved in front of their faces on streaming services all the time. And I guess Mubi is going a long way in helping that. But even then, that costs, what, $15 a month. And you have a smaller library than you get with a Netflix or what are the other big streaming services, Hulu, Amazon Prime. They do give you more options. And so I love Mubi. I appreciate the fact that they have such a wide range of films on offer, but I can imagine that if you're not automatically or already a big fan of that type of movie, you think, this is rather expensive. And when my 5-year-old son wants to watch something on television, I'm probably not going to head over to Mubi and put something on to occupy him for a couple of hours. It's much easier to point towards what I would call the more boring streaming services as these things that almost serve a purpose. In day-to-day life, you have to find some relatively enjoyable sitcom that you can sit down and watch with your family every night so you can spend time together. Whereas watching a 2.5 hour long art house film together, for as much as I wish I could do that to my good friends who are not into this sort of cinema, it can prove to be a tougher sell.
Hey, we sit down and watch Dark Shadows every night. So, which sometimes I do stop and think we've got 75-inch giant 4K television. And I think, and we're sitting here watching Dark Shadows. Okay. I am cheap. I do have to say that is probably another thing. And I am a DVD collector. I enjoy going to the thrift store and seeing what I can find for $1 or $2 movies. And I even said that to my niece, who now has the toddler niece. And I said, for $1 or $2, some of these little kid DVD movies, I mean, if the disc breaks or the kid loses interest, do you even have something that plays DVDs? And she's like, well, I guess maybe my Xbox does. She's like, but no, we have enough streaming things that we don't need to, worry about discs anymore. And it's funny because I tend to not rent things online because I go, well, gee, I would pay to go see it in a theater, but then I think, gee, to only rent it for a little while, I would much more rather have ownership. I'm still waiting for other things that I see that I'm hoping they actually come out on DVD. Instead of just, being like, oh, darn, I do have to do the digital own of this, because what actually is that, digitally owning something? And I was thinking of writing another op-ed about the streaming bubble, because post-pandemic, pandemic is still crazy. People have bill problems. Things are tight. And not every person can afford to have every platform all the time. It's just unrealistic. And it's amazing to think that these, I don't know, Amazon, Hulu may even fall back into Disney Plus, or Disney Plus may sell it off or something. It's in HBO falling apart, or Showtime becoming a part of Paramount. It's funny that we're effectively back to like the big three networks, which is kind of a strange thing to think, that even with all this technology, everything is just collapsing and condensing. And
Yes.
it's overwhelming. You know, I have a lot of blind spots just because I think there's too much to see.
Yes. And I think the streaming system is bad. I think it will collapse at some point under all of this financial strain. At the same time, I am baffled by the people who get nostalgic for the era in which video rental stores were popular. That was a nightmare. You had to pay so much money just to rent out one video. Streaming is bad. It is not an ideal system. But sorry, you were paying what? $17 to get this massive library of films. In the days of video rental stores, you had to pay maybe half of that monthly cost to rent one video, and the store probably had a very limited selection of films. So I suppose I understand you have these fond childhood memories of going to the store and picking out Romancing the Stone and watching it with your brother, but no, financially, that was not a great system. Let's not pretend that this was an era in which capitalism didn't reign.
You know, the irony, I guess, how people have such short memories, because Blockbuster, it was like, yeah, you could sign up and be regular and get your ticket and your bonus points or something. But if you missed something, and that late fee was exorbitant and ridiculous and outrageous. My favorite thing was when you could go over and look to the previewed movies like after the fact. You know, I enjoyed the browsing for the obscure films that you could sometimes find, because everything wasn't so dominated by, you know, one or two studios. And it's interesting, when Blockbuster was closing by where I lived, I would go every week when they would start to lower the prices, and you could see the difference between, they would literally have hundreds of copies of, you know, the Marvel movies all stacked up as tall as a person. And then I would say, I'm not buying those for $20 a piece. That's absurd. But then I would be so excited that when I would see something like Hunger and Fish Tank, these kind of indie obscure films where they only had one copy, and I'd say, okay, that I'm snatching. That is what I want. You know, so it was the ability to physically be able to find, maybe not necessarily what you were looking for, but new opportunities. I feel like in a weird reverse way, you had less blind spots, because you could look at something and say, what is this? This could be interesting. I'm going to take a chance on this. Where I feel like streaming, half of it is just browsing. And I've retreated into my comfort zones, you know, where I keep watching the same things that I like, rather than, well, let me take a chance on something new. I'm going to put on Clue again and fall asleep watching that, you know. Do you have any of those kind of favorites that you fall back on as a blind spot?
Well, that doesn't count as a blind spot. That's the opposite of a blind spot. No, it doesn't.
No, it's not. When you prefer when you've got favoritism, you know, I've watched a lot of bad movies for Sean Bean. I can't lie. I do have my husband says I've got a whole tableau of men. Is this one of your men? You're watching a movie just because this person's in it? And I'm like, no, that's not true. I would still be watching the movie without the person. Maybe I wouldn't try and find something good about it or justify it. Maybe that's what it is. I feel the need to justify my favorites. So is that a blind spot? I don't know.
I think that's the opposite of the definition of a blind spot. You know too much about these specific films and these specific actors in a way. But sorry, getting back to the main topic, the main through line, blind spots that I have. So one that I would cite is, similarly to Kristin, I find it very difficult to keep up with cool indie cinema from the 2010s. There's just too much available. There are so many movies from, say, 2013 that people have recommended to me, and I can't keep up with it. Every now and then I try to watch one of them, but there's this weird sense that the list just keeps getting longer. And so I don't want to be one of those people who looks at the experience of consuming cinema as this awful sort of list ticking exercise where you're just trying to get through these films. I want to enjoy them. I want to savor them. I don't want to force myself through films that I have no real interest in watching just because they are of historical interests. I really want to be watching things that I'm fairly certain I will get something out of them. At the same time, I just honestly, one of these days, I should focus on narrowing it all down and just putting together a master list of all of these 2010s movies that I need to keep up with. Because I've seen the very basic surface level stuff, but I've never seen, I don't know, Blue Ruin or Upstream Color. And these aren't even really indie movies. These received wide releases, I believe, at the time that they were first put out, and they were very well reviewed. It's not as though these are super obscure movies, and yet I just struggle to work up the motivation to watch them. And maybe part of it is the sense that some of these older films have an even more towering reputation. And so there's this sense that, oh, it's a classic. You absolutely have to see this. Whereas some of these 2010s movies, you can be a bit dubious about whether it really is as good as people said it was 5 years ago. And maybe in 10 years' time, we'll look back on it and say, it was fine. And so it's easy to convince yourself that, well, I should be watching Alfred Hitchcock's Marnie instead of putting myself through this movie.
May we not live in interesting times. Unfortunately, it does not work for us. There are films that I still have in my queue that are from 2015 or earlier that at first I think, oh, this is recent. And then I think, oh, no, it's not. Geez, this is pre-Trumpian. Like my outlook on this film could be completely different now watching it than it would have been then. And then I think, so what is the point of me watching it? Or when something is so popular, and so like all these lists that do like the best of decades, and they have things that are so recent on them, I think, really, is it, if it's that good and if it's that popular and someone has already spoken that much for it, why should I bother to review it and have something critical to say of it if it's already popular? I'd rather find something that's different and special. And it's funny. I think we've discussed before, like about like the regions that used to be on, like they're still on the DVDs and Blu-rays, not being able to have access to something that's in a different region. And our Amy Smith had talked about this in the UK, of how it becomes part of the marketing that something is not released in the UK till after, so they could say it's won awards. It's already #1 in the US. That it's like, I don't know. It seems when films are being forced upon you, if anything, that makes me kind of recoil at them. And it's funny because as much as I say favorite actors, one of the things that I do think is a blind spot is I get really kind of hateful towards certain actors, which I know is really wrong. For example, how do you pronounce his name correctly? The Timothy Chalamet.
Yes.
Never seen anything with him in it, because it's like, oh my God, the latest new It person. You have to see this movie. I think I did start watching Call Me by Your Name, which, I'm sorry, ironically also had, crazy Arnie Hammer in it. It's like this, I'm looking at this going, this feels more pedophilia than it does a sweeping gay romance. And I'm like, maybe again, is that my wrong point of view? But I'm like, this doesn't interest me. I don't see what's so special. Why is this person being so in your face? It's like It Boy, like that, it makes me like completely turn away, which I know I probably should not, but I can't help it.
No, I can see what you're saying there. And honestly, I'm not prejudiced against people who feel that way. I think that it's completely fair for certain people to look at a certain actor or even a director and say, just not for me. I think you're lying if you're going to tell me that you've never watched a film and seen an actor and thought, for some reason, I want to punch that person in the face. Like they get on my nerves, they rub me the wrong way. I do not enjoy the experience of watching this person up on the screen. And I think it's a perfectly natural human response, as long as you're not one of those people who goes online and harasses said person. That's fine. If you just have a sense that you don't like that particular actor, then that's fine. Stay away from them. It's not really a problem in my eyes. I feel as though you encounter these people who insist, well, oh no, you should keep an open mind about absolutely everything. And how dare you dislike this specific actor? You're being closed-minded. And I think it's just something that happens sometimes. I don't think it's a sign that this person is evil. At the same time, I guess it becomes a bigger problem if, say, your prejudice is rooted in racism or sexism or one of the awful isms or phobias that exist within our society. However, if it's just you not loving the fact that Ethan Hawke half grins all the time in his movies, then that's fine. I'm not upset with you about that. And I'm annoyed by the holier-than-thou people who insist, oh no, I like everything. I've never had an irrational response to a piece of art.
What are you trying to say, Zita? You're not a fan of Ethan Hawke?
No, personally, I love Ethan Hawke. I think he's great. Okay. I just know that there are plenty of people who are annoyed by his screen presence. And I bring it up because I'm one of those people who doesn't get it. I think he's fun. I think he's a great actor. But there are people out there who do not want to watch Gattaca or Boyhood.
It's interesting the way things change, because now we've got, nasty Harvey Weinstein was pushing some of these, supposedly the it girls up to win all these awards, back 20 some years ago. And even then there was a lot of industry writing, like that, the stories about Gretchen Mol or something, of why is this girl suddenly in everyone's everywhere on all the magazine covers. And I feel like it was less intrusive then, as opposed to now. I've said this before, I still don't know who Ana de Armas is. I still could not pick her out of a lineup. I'm sorry. Even though, I've actually saw headlines of her saying, the celebrity mystery is dead because of social media. And I'm thinking, but lady, weren't you doing pap strolls with Ben Affleck? I mean, doesn't that have something to do with it too? And I'm like, I feel terrible. I should be able to judge this person just on their performance in a film alone. But it's like, the society we live in today, I feel like that's not possible. This Timothy Chalamet. I'm not a fan of the Alicia, I'm not even sure if that's how you say her name correctly, Alicia Vikander, and the Eddie Raidman. So I was like, well, I have no interest in the Danish Girl at all. So it becomes this, I don't know, the press or the marketing or something comes on so fast and so strong that it's just like, I'm not here for it. Good on you, but it's not for me. And I feel like that's the opposite of how films should be. Shouldn't they be trying to cater to everybody?
The one thing I'd say about that is that the notion that stars used to be more real, in finger quotes, I disagree with. These publicity pushes that people are so annoyed with now were 10 times more artificial and over the top back in 1946, when movie stars were much bigger. And so all of these film stars that you think you have had an authentic response to, you think, oh yes, I like this actor because I know how I feel. No, the film studio has played a very big role in determining what this person's appeal is going to look like. And they've probably done demographic targeting. They've done all of these studies to determine what certain audiences want. And so anytime that someone becomes a massive star, the studio has put so much work into turning this person into a universally likable figure. And that's just not real. It's obviously fake. And so, God, in the case of Harvey Weinstein, of course, it's horrible that sexual harassment was involved. At the same time, every studio sort of behaved that way back in those days. Gwyneth Paltrow, Brad Pitt, Matthew McConaughey, these other 90s stars that we might look upon more favorably, they also went through that machine, and there were a bunch of magazine covers that they featured on that they got purely because the studio wanted to bump them up. So it's just one of those things that you accept with Hollywood. No one is ever going to become a star based entirely off of their talent. It's because they're attractive and they're charismatic in some way, and they are being shoved into your face all the time. And again, if you hate Timothy Chalamet and Gretchen Mol, I completely get that. But I just think it's ridiculous sometimes online when people imply that there was some era in which everything was different to this and better. And, oh, in the past, we never used to get these fawning articles about how some actor who has appeared in 2 films is the next big thing. This has always happened since the beginning of time.
You could tell the difference between the people who don't play that kind of Hollywood game. Those are the people in which I'm interested. Those are the films I'm interested in seeing. Well, what else did you have on your list?
So this is an incredibly broad category of films, but I'm not terribly familiar with a lot of Turkish cinema, and I apologize for using such a broad descriptor. Obviously, there are various different subsets of Turkish cinema, various different movements from different periods in history, and it's this incredibly rich, vibrant type of cinema. It's not just this homogenous set of films. At the same time, I feel as though I do need to use such a wide-ranging description, because I've seen about 14 Turkish films, and I have made an effort to see the most popular, widely seen films from that country that won awards at festivals and received universal acclaim from Anglophone critics. And so I would really like to get into some of the more obscure stuff. The problem there is, 1, tracking these films down, and 2, essentially just trying to narrow down what it is that I should see. For as much as I loved something like Yol, how do I find that director's other works? And it can prove to be more difficult than you expect it to be. Even in the case of, say, French language cinema, which I think for a lot of us English speakers is probably the easiest to track down, because they do have a massive apparatus behind them, and generally you can find these films subtitled, and there are plenty of French language stars that cross over into the American market. At the same time, even in that case, if you want to go back a couple of decades, it's really hard to find some of these movies. So I suppose this whole episode is just going to be me complaining about the fact that I can't find these movies. But even in this case, I will condemn myself here, because it is true that I could have dedicated more time to watching these movies. There are plenty of allegedly great foreign films that I chose to shirk off in favor of an English language film that is, let's say, less acclaimed.
Well, bless you. I would never have thought of Turkish cinema. Also a blind spot for me then. It's funny that we both have said, different foreign aspects are part of our blind spots just because of inaccessibility. It's funny. You don't speak another language? That surprises me. I thought everybody did nowadays.
Oh, God, I wish I did. I took high school Spanish. I was a complete disaster. And unfortunately, the New Zealand school system is set up in such a way that it's easy to not cheat on the Spanish language exam, but they give you this text written in Spanish, to be fair, and then they provide you with a couple of English language questions about, oh, what's it about? What did you think they were implying there? And if you know enough of the basic vocabulary, you can get a general sense of what they're talking about, but you do not gain the ability to understand sentence structure or to conjugate verbs or to conduct a conversation with someone in this language. You know nothing, essentially. So, sorry, this is me criticizing the education system instead of owning up to the fact that I was the problem. But oh well.
That's okay. Yeah, I have problems with our education system. We had 2 years of Latin first, and then you got to choose a foreign language. And if not enough people signed up for the foreign language class, then they didn't have the foreign language class. And I find it frustrating when I do watch Spanish films when the subtitles, or if I have to have dubbing on it, when they don't match what the spoken Spanish is. That I find infuriating, because you're dumbing it down in English, and that's changing the syntax of the story and you know what's happening, and it's really frustrating. And you know, where I live is much more intermixed, and you know, we have Telemundo kind of television channels that I used to really enjoy watching until they would put on one of the Brazilian soap operas and it was in Portuguese. And then I'd be like, oh my God, I lost it. I can't understand what's happening. You would think I'd be able to pick up the Portuguese, but no, I couldn't. And so I guess the Portuguese side is a blind spot. And that's what I find frustrating about those Mexican horror films. I would love to track those down. But even when you go to Internet Movie Database and you try and specialize the year and the Spanish language, it slowly skews to Spanish horror movies from the 70s. And it's in Spain. And it's that's not what I wanted. I wanted Mexico in the 50s, but they get lumped together. And I'm guilty of this as a critic when I'm trying to make up some of these horror lists where I end up putting a lot of these foreign things together. And I remember getting in an argument with someone because they were talking about Selma Hayek and Penelope Cruz. And they're like, well, you know, one of those types. And I'm like, but they're two different cultures. They don't belong together. And I feel like we just get this quote homogenous of the foreign, and the German film and the Turkish film, we lump all those together. So it's very frustrating when you are trying to look for something specific and you can't find it, you know. And I feel like Hollywood likes it that way because they just want you to watch the next thing that's streaming. No big deal.
Yes, sorry, I was just taking a moment to soak all of that up. Oh. No, I understand what you're getting at there, and it is frustrating, especially, I assume, if you are one of those very well-educated, forbiddingly intellectual Germans who speaks 5 languages and has a very strong understanding of all of the manners in which these different traditions in European cinema are wildly varied and so far away from one another that I'm sure it sounds absolutely hilarious and absurd when we as Anglophones sort of group all of them together. At the same time, this is an awful thing to acknowledge, but your example of Penelope Cruz and Selma Hayek, obviously, if you're a relatively sophisticated individual who is sensitive, you would understand that, yes, they have very different cultural backgrounds. Even the roles that they've taken on are relatively different. In Hollywood terms, especially in the 2000s, or I guess the late 90s, in Hayek's case, when they were both coming up, I assume that they are very racist and they do not notice that there are differences between Mexican and Spanish culture. And I think you do notice a lot of Cruz's early roles in Hollywood are very stereotypical. They are both cast as these sexy Latina types. There's not a huge amount of variety in a lot of these early roles. And so I just assume that they automatically put those actresses into the same bucket, even though anyone who's watched a lot of their performances would notice that these are actresses with very different temperaments, with different skill sets, who would be suited to different projects. But not defending what that person said, but I do think they were probably sold to the American public in a similar manner. Look at this sexy foreigner. I don't think much more than that went into it.
And it's sad because I know I do have a lot of blind spots when it comes to actresses, as opposed to my favorite classic men who I will watch their entire catalog. You asked me this before, like what were my favorite women, top 5 classic actresses, and I'm like, I don't really have that many, 1 or 2 maybe, because I just don't seek them out the same way. And again, I feel like it is because they get pigeonholed. Who's the blonde bombshell? Who's the avant-garde? Who was the femme fatale? And that kind of pigeonholing, again, doesn't really interest me.
And then another huge blind spot that I have, and this again, this descriptor encompasses so many different types of films and so many different cultures, but 90s cinema in general seems to be a real problem for me. I think a part of it is I can't get rid of this division in my mind between what I see as classic cinema, which for some reason encompasses the 80s, even though everyone agrees. And I think you would notice as a film historian that that is definitely a dividing point between all of the cinema that we sort of respect from the 60s and 70s, and then Hollywood's slow descent into madness and their attempts to infantilize audiences. But for some reason, whenever I see a 90s film on a list of the greatest films ever made, a part of me is resistant towards it. It just seems forced for some reason, which is a ridiculous take to have, because the entire point of one of those lists is that it isn't forced. There is no deity determining what the greatest films of all time are. It's just a collection of random critics who all have their own very different subjective tastes. And I usually think that is beautiful. I think there is something wonderful about the fact that, say, the Sight and Sound list, even though it's this amalgamation, you do get to look at those ballots and you do see how much range there is among this group of people. And I think it's a really horrible take that certain people have, that they want there to be this critical consensus. At the same time, for some reason, there's always a part of me, whenever I see these lists, that thinks, oh, God, so this is a person who probably came up as a film critic in the 1990s, and they're trying to pretend that the films they saw in the first few years of being a film critic are as great as Gertrude and The Story of the Lost Chrysanthemums. And I don't buy it. Chungking Express, it's good. It's a good movie. I have nothing against it. The notion that it's one of the best movies ever made, I just can't get on board with it. And perhaps some of it is a weird representation of my own self-hatred or a resistance to the times that we're living in. I know a lot of people talk about the fact that everyone assumes that the decade that we're currently living through is this low point for art, and things will surely get better in the future. And, oh, weren't things great before I was born? So maybe that's it. Maybe I'm resistant to 90s art because it's too close for comfort and it seems too familiar and it doesn't have the exotic appeal of cinema from the 40s. Anyway, getting back to why I haven't watched enough 90s films. That's it. I always feel, and you've spoken about this, as though they're being foisted upon me, and I never quite trust, and this is ridiculous, an entire decade of cinema, and I choose to feel this way. I never trusted when I read rave reviews of films from the 90s, especially when they invoke an older film in the review. I think, how dare you suggest that this is a Boonwell film for the Gen X era? I don't believe it. I can't take them at their word. So I'm very resistant to a lot of 90s cinema, you could say. And that is something that I have to grow out of. It's ridiculous. I can recognize the fact that I'm being an immature fool. And yet I can't let go of these feelings, and I can't help but see a lot of 90s films as ersatz product, even 80s movies, which everyone would acknowledge are worse in so many regards, just have more charm in my eyes. They don't feel as bland in a weird way, or they don't have such a sense of self-importance. I don't know. It's ridiculous.
That's truly like literally the color of the era. The 80s were brighter and they were kitschy, and the 90s were just cynical and bleak. But then it's like, I want to say, well, but Goodfellas, which it comes full circle, because how many times has like a male film critic been like, oh my God, you haven't seen The Godfather? Like, oh, for shame, you know, that your opinion doesn't count if you've not seen The Godfather, or you have to see Citizen Kane, you know, like you're like, no, okay, I stop trying to force these movies on me, which I have been guilty of, you know, making people watch The Godfather, but that's an Italian issue more so than anything. Don't like 90s movies. No, see, there are films that I absolutely adore from the 90s that made me stand up and take note of, oh, okay, there are great films happening. And then the 2000s happened and it was like, what happened? No. And this is, again, I also come back to my blind spot with awards season. You know, I don't think these awards are indicative of what is the quality films anymore. So when I see something that is apparently won all kinds of love and acclaim, when I'm trying to find it a couple of years later, I'm like, that doesn't appeal to me at all. I'd rather see something that said like won a film festival and only had limited release. It's like, that's the movie I want to see, compared to the film that, you know, won all the big awards. But we've discussed that before. I'm not an awards fan at all. So we don't like the man, basically. We don't like the man telling us what to watch.
Oh, I suppose. And I guess that's a good point that you make. Sorry for cutting it there. I apologize.
No, we're getting into our giggle phase now at the hour mark.
I guess the point that you make, though, is important, in that so much of what you wrestle with as a cinephile is this idea of the canon, which is a loosely defined term, but I think everyone would be generally familiar with some of these legitimate lists that you come across, such as, say, the Sight and Sound lists, which are these sort of standard bearers for taste, and they determine sort of the set of films that every cineast starting out sort of needs to watch in order to get their bearings, to get a basic understanding of the history of cinema. And in some ways, I think it is positive to have those lists, in part because I think something like that would always exist. I think it's sort of impossible to avoid list making and ranking and building up a canon in this film criticism industry. At the same time, I sort of understand what people are saying when they point out that it can feel limiting and oppressive to have this specific set of films that they feel are prized above all others. I think the thing that I would recommend, and this is such an obvious point to make, but it's important to view that sort of list, or the canon itself, as just a jumping off point, instead of thinking, oh, I get through this list of films and then I'm done. I know everything about cinema now, and there's no need for me to explore any further or to watch some of the films that weren't highlighted on these lists. I think the thing that you encounter in a lot of cases is that, say, you have a respected director, and because there are a finite amount of places or spaces on this list, they pick the best of that director's films, even if there are some critics participating in the poll who think, oh, well, actually, if I were putting together a list of my favourite films, I might have 3 or 4 films by that director on my top 10, but they narrow it down to 1. And so I think the whole point is essentially just to get a sampler of cinema. And so you can determine from watching these movies whether you really like Michelangelo Antonioni and want to watch The Passenger and Zabriskie Point after seeing L'Avventura. Do you love old Hollywood cinema? Do you love Howard Hawks? Or do you think he's a phony? I don't think anybody thinks that. But let's say you have a very strong reaction against one of these films. At least that provides you with some sense of your own taste. And so I don't know, I think it can be a positive force having this canon, because it gives people the ability to sort of build up their own identity and to gain a greater understanding of what their interests as a cinephile, as a film buff are.
We love talking in our own little bubble here at Women in Session, having our own conversations and topics, because we have so many things to say and share. But I know you didn't want to know some of our episodes, which topics do better or worse than others. And when I asked JD, he said some of our highest rated ones were the episodes that we did on Alfred Hitchcock. And part of me thought, is that just because of the name recognition alone? And it's funny, like Erica and Shadon like to go through the best picture lists to work their way through seeing films and their blind spots. And we all agree, like, oh, what a fascinating exercise. What nice lists. But how many things are you missing by going by those lists? But then Erica talks about, having, the academia of going to different film schools and taking different courses. And all of a sudden it's like, wow, there's like an education behind this, like, tell me more. You've read up more on this compared to, when you see any old person can just go make a list of their favorites. And I've actually gotten different negative comments when I've done the top 10 lists at In Session Film, because people say, like, how could you not have seen this one? Or how could you not have included that one? And I'll say, well, it's relative. Sometimes I'm choosing things that are the things that are obscure, that are different, or maybe they have a smaller role in it, but it's a better film, that these are things that I think you should see because there's something unique about them, not because it's just, this is the standard that you have to see. And it's like, why does that bother you so much, to have a different idea or a different opinion? So I don't know if that's the vitriol of the internet. We want everything fast and quick rather than, taking a class on film, which I think would be far more interesting and far more inviting than some of the arguments and mess, like all that was happening on film Twitter Oscar night. It's just, sometimes it seems so angry, which is sad, because to me, talking about film should be fun.
Yes. And one of the problems that I've identified with awards season is that it gets really ugly. And it weirdly feels like a gambling community in a way, instead of it being about people being passionate about these films. It's them getting involved in stan culture, in essence. And it seems as though the film itself or the performance that they're rooting for ceases to exist, and it becomes all about them. And I guess that's fine, but it's just not fun how aggressive it gets. And you think, at the end of the day, this doesn't mean much. At the same time, that I've been through and I've watched all of the Best Picture nominees. And we've discussed this ad nauseum. If you are a long-time listener, I'm sorry for touching on this again, but it is most interesting, as Erica noted, as this historical time capsule. And it is interesting to get a sense of what people were really into in this period that hasn't necessarily held up.
I guess today there's more of a divide in what's just entertainment, what's more popcorn, which I can take. Sometimes I want to shut off my brain. And as I said, I want to revert back to these kind of comfort, kind of feel-good movies. But I love the idea of film as history. We have a whole century now that's documented in film, and that's just so fascinating. And I get so infuriated when you think about how all that can get lost because I don't know, people are too busy chasing what's instant and what's popular now. And it's like that doesn't interest me. That seems so short-sighted, which I feel like is the opposite of what I think when I'm doing film criticism. You know, I feel like there should be something insightful. There should be something of merit, not just some, knee jerk, how many characters are in a tweet or something. So it's strange, like we get tepid when we say, tweet us, in session, tell us what your thoughts are. And then we're like, but we don't want anything negative. And I feel like part of that again is because we're women and we know that there are people out there who want to automatically be like, well, you can't possibly know anything about this kind of film. Or of course you have a problem with the popcorn action maybe because you're a chick, and it's just, or horror, like when you have to be like, yeah, bitch, cool, hot, show us your boobs or something. It just seems like there's just so much negativity that can just really take the fun out of it. And I've said before, I feel like, great films should be able to have a life-changing experience. And it's, I don't know, we're so busy looking for something smaller than that, which is just, that doesn't make sense to me. That's not the point of art.
Yes, that is true. And I'm sure this has been a bit of a meandering episode. Perhaps I came up with a terrible idea, but I hope that maybe this will make us more relatable. I'm not sure. I'm sure you're listening to this thinking that I'm a bit silly, but at the same time, I guess it's important to sort of shed light on your shortcomings as a film critic, and hopefully over the next 8 months we'll have time to sort of work through some of these blind spots, to open ourselves up to some of these classics that we haven't seen. And I do think it's really encouraging that in your case, especially, you're not looking towards specific films, but it's more of a sense of wanting to expand your boundaries in a general sense. And I think that's great, because for so many people, it is this unfortunate rut that they get stuck in, where being a cinephile becomes oddly competitive. And you do notice this on a site like Letterboxd, for example, where people become addicted to the dopamine rush that comes from logging these films, to a point where they don't savor or fully take in the experience of actually watching these movies and fully appreciating them. And I think that's sad. And I think it's great that in your case, you are relatively unswayed by the critical consensus, and you're not tied down by the fact that you feel the need to watch these films that you might know in some part of yourself that you won't really enjoy.
I thought about, I'm looking here at my nice bookcases with all my movies and all my physical media piled up here. And I thought about tweeting of like, oh, here's the picture, tell me what thing you want my opinion and I'll watch it and review it. And I thought, but that seems like it could become such a chore, like bending your view and rushing to film something, feeling forced and obligated rather than enjoying the movie, which is the point. And in our beginning 2023 episode, when we said what were our goals, and I said I'm trying to watch more recent things, did you say yours was animation?
Yes, animation is also up there for me. I think I'm making a couple of strides. I've seen a few more Miyazaki films since we last talked about that, but definitely still one of those areas in which I'm hopelessly uneducated. If someone asked me seriously, so what are your favorite animated features? I have very dull, normie-based taste in that area. And, oh God, I turn into a complete film bro, you could say, when it comes to that subject. So hopefully I can open myself up to some of the more artistic examples of the genre instead of just watching Shrek 2 and Shark Tale.
nothing excites me more when you find a new film that like really excites you. And I was really excited when I saw In Fabric. I saw Fresh. I like that one. I wrote about The Banishing at InSessionFilm.com. That was a Christopher Smith movie, and really greatly. It's funny because I didn't intend to do like women's horror movies for Women's Horror Month at In Session, but The Banishing was very much like a post-war, you know, a woman who had a baby, you know, out of wedlock and is a little shamed for it, you know, and this idea of, you know, that we elevate women as mothers, but kind of shame them for the sex of it, you know, and now I'm finishing up one on She Will, an Alice Krieg movie where she's a starlet who has had a mastectomy, and just the visuals of when she's holding like the fake prosthetics, and it's like the woman holding the literally the breast in her hands, and that is horror, you know, and it's like, wow, this is something that is, you know, really striking me. I didn't need a special effect of a chainsaw slicing off a boob and wonder, gee, wow, how'd they do that? You know, it was just the real psychological horror of this, you know, diseases that butcher, you know, who you are as a woman and what society says who you should be as a woman. You know, these are the kind of things that are like, oh, okay, I'm mentally intrigued. This is a provocative film. This is, you know, yes, how exciting and invigorating that is, as opposed to if it was like, well, if I worked for a website where I had to watch every single one of these mainstream movies where it was like, I'm obligated to do this. It's no fun. And I feel like we've come full circle, because that's how I feel about like these angry old white male critics gatekeeping, where it's like, has it become such a chore to you that you're watching everything? Well, it's like, who's making you do that? You know, you should enjoy movies, right? What are you working on at In Session Film, Zita?
Well, at the moment, I'm trying to work on a couple of interviews that I'm attempting to set up. So hopefully that works out. But it's always sort of up in the air with film publicists. One week, they're contacting you all the time saying, oh, well, we could schedule it for this date. And then it's just radio silence for a while. So very confusing. But hopefully something works itself out.
Hey, we were confused by daylight savings time.
Yes. Oh, God.
So who knows? You know, you would think time and technology would help people. It does bring us together, but it does separate us a lot. You know, it's tough. We've never had all 6 of our ladies together at once, just because we're trying to, you know, work with technology and time zones. It would be fun for us, yes, as I said, to do more interviews and more guests, because even though we're women and we have, you know, different diverse ladies in different walks of life, it's that, you know, we want to illume, you know, even more diverse voices. And there's still topics that, you know, we're not qualified to speak on. So, but we do write on what we claim to be qualified on, not our blind spots, at InSessionFilm.com. Zita, your final thoughts on your blind spots? Are you going to watch more Turkish films?
Yes, I hope so. This has been a bit of an embarrassing episode, but maybe it's good to put your points of shame out there in the public, and hopefully I can become a more educated individual and stop pushing away these films or shirking my responsibilities in favor of watching yet another Faye Dunaway vehicle from the early 70s that has been largely forgotten by the public.
Hey, Amazon with their freebie, they put up a Neighbors live stream that I've been watching, and I'm like, oh my God, the hair. The hair of the 80s, it's all coming back to me now. Like, no. So yeah, I've seen a few bad things in my life that I probably should get out and watch more good films. You are at Zita_short, and you have your 300 Passions podcast as well. I'm Kristin Battestella at Therefore Review. InSessionFilm.com is where you can find what we have written, and you can follow. If you do have some comments, positive we prefer, but negative, it's okay, at In Session Film on Twitter. And you can also follow the Patreon and see our flagship podcast, the big podcast. They just had their Chasing the Gold. I'm sure they're going to have their Oscars fallout. It's coming up soon on YouTube where you can watch them as well. See, hear, read, everything like that. Zita, thank you for being here and thank you for listening. And we'll see you at the next Women in Session.
When you save on auto insurance for driving safe with USAA Safe Pilot, you'll feel like a big deal, even in a traffic jam. Save up to 30% with USAA Safe Pilot. Restrictions apply.